this opportunity. Rather, I feel as I'm treading on hallowed ground. I wasn't sure whether the audience would be people who, from my student days here in the 70s, but I'm sure, no, 60s, feel they know more about it than I do. Or the younger students who may never have heard of Leslie Martin. I'm not quite sure, so it's difficult to know. So the first image is simply because the image on the right there was what I used for the publicity of the thing, which it rather than a drawing by Corbusier, because I know that Corbusier Centre wants to charge you a lot to allow any use of anything by Corbusier, and secondly forbids you to put anything on top of it, so which is required. So that is actually an estate near me, designed by Carl Ludwig Frank, who was Lubetkin's right-hand man, really, in Tecton, and who became the housing architect for Finsbury Metropolitan Borough after, well, Lubetkin and Tecton had broken up, and then Joseph Emberton took over, and then he died suddenly in an architecture club dinner, and at that point Carl Ludwig Frank, who was working for him, took over. Ludwig Frank is not a well-known name here, but he was the top German architecture student in 1931, Rome Scholar of Germany and so on, and he came to London because he had a Jewish wife, and he built much more housing in Finsbury than Lubetkin and Tecton ever did. And these estates are vulnerable and are being built. The interstices in these estates are being built on by the council as part of various densification schemes, because the feeling for space, which is intrinsic to them, is something that is really has died, I think. I think that so I want to talk about that, because I think that although this particular estate has taller blocks than Corbusier ever proposed for housing, in other words, those two blocks are about 26 stories, because Corbusier never really advocated housing higher than about 20. Nevertheless, it's the feeling of space is and of greenery, the green city. That's the Ville Verte was Corbusier's great. Sorry, now this. How is that? Was his great campaign, really, and it obviously influenced housing a lot in the 50s and 60s. And I don't think it was helped by Leslie Martin, as we will discover, I hope, in my talk. But a thing like that, this is two other photos of this same estate. The architectural potential is I'm just can I go back there a minute? Just it's you'll see that this block down here called Turnpike House, and down there is on axis. There was an axis. In fact, there was a square garden there which was bombed, but there's an axis that leads through to the church, 1820 by Thomas Hardwick there. So there's very much a formal composition, and also the idea of two slab blocks at right angles to one another, which is an important idea, creating a space between them. So there's a potential here for something that I think is not appreciated now. This is looking from the portico of the church towards Turnpike House. And this is looking down from Turnpike House on this greenery. And this is really the best example I know of in central London of the idea of the green city as a residential environment. And that's the outlook there, certainly that kind of outlook that Corbusier thought everyone should have from their house. Everybody here will know these pictures properly, but Leslie Martin on the right there, and the Corbusier on the left, and Henry Moore behind him receiving the honorary doctorates. I'm sure at the instigation of Leslie Martin in 1959. And so Leslie had a complicated relationship, I think, with Corbusier and his ideas, which I hope to explore a bit. I'm sorry that the lecture today, which I'd imagined was going to be in the other, like all the others in the series, in the other lecture room, the one where Corbusier himself lectured, as in this photo, with Leslie Martin. But unfortunately, on this particular Wednesday, it had to be here, which is a loss of historical kind of appropriateness. But you must imagine yourselves in the other one, built by designed by Sandy Wilson, very much under the influence of Corbusier. The other picture here, which is less well known, is of Henry Moore drawing a portrait of Corbusier in that same lecture room, blind, as it were. In other words, he's drawing it without looking at what he's drawing. I don't know whether that survives. It would be nice to see if it did, or perhaps Henry Moore was too embarrassed by it and tore it up or something. But anyway, so Martin obviously, and that looks like a nice drawing by Corbusier on the paper behind him there. Perhaps of the Henry Moore with its holes through, I'm not quite sure. Very plastic. And so Martin obviously emulated Corbusier. I mean, these are the two, a typical volume of the Corbusier oeuvre complète there on the left, and Leslie Martin's Buildings and Ideas on the same format on the right. And of course, Martin, when I was a student here, was a huge, I mean, I was completely in awe of him. He was this man who, with his record of building the festival hall and of this, which are on the left there, and his plans for rebuilding building a new British Library opposite the British Museum there, with this amazing courtyard with the BM at one end and St George's Bloomsbury at the other, which I always think would have been terrific, potentially. But of course, didn't happen. And the festival hall, though Grade 1 listed, all that wonderful canopy over and the whole of the stage end has been completely reshaped in a way that I feel is unwelcome. But nevertheless, I felt as a student here and subsequently that there was a very fundamental difference of approach or objective between Martin and Corbusier. So on the left there, you see a sketch by Corbusier explaining how his design for the Ministry of Health and Education in Rio departs from the courtyard format that was the emploi traditionnel, the traditional way of building in Rio, and of course in cities throughout the world, that you pile up the accommodation into a single slab across the middle of the site. Not more, but the same amount, let us say. And you immediately improve the environment, both for the occupants of the building and for the users of the streets, because the occupants of the building then have a broad outlook, light, space and greenery, which was Corbusier's objectives. The people on the ground don't have to follow narrow pavements between the roadway and the face of the building. They can wander across amongst the trees. And there's a lot of spatial potential there. But the Martin diagram on the right reverses that. It says exactly the opposite. It says we could have a pavilion or courtyard, then if we have the courtyard floor at the bottom there, we can do the same amount of accommodation, but in 1/3 of the height. That was the typical kind of Martin claim. The trouble is also that that only applies to that particular site. When you put the two courtyards next to one another and so on, then you have further problems. But that was the reversal. And so from his point of view, the fact that you were building it lower was its prime recommendation. That has all kinds of implications. In almost all his writings, he says, no need for tall buildings, or buildings can be at least 1/3 lower, but without that is sufficient justification offered. There is no consideration of the conditions within the building, for example, which might mean that in a taller building, the occupants have a much more favourable environment. But that kind of argument, of course, was very current in the 30s. These are just two diagrams from the 30s. I mean, on the left, the R and the leading Swedish architect and planner. It's from 1931. So he shows a sort of typical jumble at the top, a sort of formalized courtyard halfway down, and then underneath the Zealandbau, the parallel blocks, which were felt at that time the answer, because they avoided having internal courtyards, and every block could have the correct orientation and so on. And on the right is a very similar progression illustrated in the Key to Modern Architecture by FRS York, subsequently of York, Rosenberg and Mardell, and Stuart Penn, who was briefly a partner of Ernö Goldfinger, but that's 1938. So again, the progression is from the sort of jumbled courtyard, a lot of internal extensions, to a formalized courtyard, and subsequently to the Zealandbau parallel blocks. Now, of course, the Rio ministry is not parallel blocks like that, and in fact, Corbusier very much disavowed these parallel blocks, but the idea of a slab on the correct orientation with space all around it, and avoiding the problems of orientation and internal corners that you get from courtyards, were very much part of his argument. And in fact, I mean, while on the subject of Rio, of course, this is a page actually from his book, The Radiant City, where he contrasts this sketch, which he says was on the left, which he says was done from an aeroplane, showing one of his projected viaduct buildings through the landscape of Rio, where the roadway would run on the top, and then underneath you would have a continuous strip of habitation with people looking out over the roofs of the existing city and seeing the landscape. And seeing the landscape was all important to him. Nature, orientation, relationship to nature was really the key to modern architecture. And he contrasts that with on the right, which he says a city planner of the classical school has once again proposed courtyards and corridor streets. So you see all these courtyards down there, and I mean, from his point of view, none of them enjoy the landscape because they don't. They look into narrow streets, and only from down that one central corridor would you get that. And I could have put an illustration now, but there's an organisation at the moment called Create Streets. I don't know whether you know, founded about 10, 12 years ago by Nicholas Boys Smith, which puts out proposals for many sites in London, which look very much like this, actually. And Boys Smith was previous government's leading consultant on more or less on beautiful buildings and everything else, but he's now lost his his that position, but because what was it called? The commission? Oh, it's the places commission or something, which he was head, which was a government thing, has been abolished by this government. But anyway, that's the point. That view on the right was very much is really the orthodoxy of today, I think. This is another view of the Rio building at the top, and it's quite interesting that at the top on the right there is the Corbusier was so concerned at Rio that the building should have a view of the landscape and be part of, well, the seascape really, that he although he'd been called out there to design a building on a particular site in the middle of the town, he spent almost his entire time finding another site and designing a building for that instead. And only at the very last minute on the way out was he told, sorry, politicians say there's no chance of moving to a different site, so you've got to do it for the site you originally did. So, so that's the one underneath there. So basically what he did was cut the slab in half and put the two bits on top of one another and create the lower drawing there. But, and I have visited that site. Unfortunately, my photos, because it was raining very heavily on that day, I don't have very good photos, but it is a very fine building indeed, with lovely stone, of course, realized not by Corb, but by Oscar Niemeyer and Lucio Costa, because during the war, actually. But it has that mosaic underneath the Palottis there by Portinari. And ceramics really, it's not really mosaic, it's Portuguese ceramics, but it's beautiful. And the stone on the columns is lovely red. So although of course it doesn't have the views of the sea that you'd hope for. It's not from the ground level, maybe it does, but so that shows the row of palm trees, and also there's a very fine image of the man of Brazil, that seated figure on the plaza, taking advantage of this urban space that is created by building like this, taking advantage of the space that you are creating by not having a courtyard. These are two other perspectives showing what it was going to look like from inside. This is his preferred site, if you like, with again the statue of the man of Brazil and the sugarloaf of Rio on the horizon. And as he's very careful to point out, the figures in the drawing below were drawn, or both drawings were drawn by Oscar Niemeyer, not by him, but the sculptures are obviously drawn by him, since he was, I think, the greatest sculptor manqué of that period. It is the view out that is the significant thing. So moving on to Leslie Martin. So the philosophy of Corbusier, by his own kind of diagram on the left there, sun, space, greenery, which is the logo, if you like, of the radiant city of the Ville Radieuse, implies openness. But Leslie Martin, we are told, came up to Cambridge because he was appointed professor in 1956. Having been responsible at the LCC for the construction of estates like Roehampton, which are very much open and landscape-based developments, if you like. But I think prior to coming up to Cambridge, he was also already, there's evidence, interested in courtyard ideas, but it's always alleged that coming up to Cambridge and seeing the courtyard or courts of Cambridge colleges reinforced this orientation. This is often reproduced engraving by Lagan or Logan, I think it is, of St. John's College. But courtyards are implicitly inward looking. as you can see here. So another two contrasts. So that's Corbusier's sketch of the Green City, 1929, on the left, and just contrasted with Leslie Martin's famous plan for rebuilding Whitehall completely from 1965, which using this courtyard format, which I'll revert to in a minute, but later. But again, the argument that that Martin advanced very much for his Whitehall scheme was nothing was going to be higher than 8 stories, or I can't remember if it was 8 or 10. I think 8 stories, and yet he was going to double the amount of accommodation on the site. But so the fact that this height was 8 stories and not 16 or 20 or something was almost a sufficient justification itself. There is no argument that I found in his writings arguing why that is necessarily a good thing, even if the outlook is inferior. I mean, obviously, all the people in these buildings are going to have very limited outlook, relatively speaking, into these courtyards. And these are further illustrations from his text, Architect's Approach to Architecture, published May '67, with top left, this physical model showing how the same amount of accommodation on a particular site can be distributed in a variety of ways, pavilions or courts. In the middle, you have a cruciform tower, which is obviously a reference to the towers that Corbusier proposed for the city of 3 million and later the Voisin plan from Paris. And the courtyards at the bottom left there. Of course, they don't explain how there is to be any access to the space. In a model of that kind is actually not adequate to tell the story. And of course, the spaces between these pavilions at the bottom are narrow slits. So you can't ignore architecture. The only thing that is architectural in that image is the cruciform tower. But Martin disliked slabs and towers of all kinds. And then on the top right, you see, like also, I'm sorry, it's such a bad a scan of a photocopy, etc. But this is from that same text showing how Portland House, as it's called at Victoria, could be rebuilt with the same amount of accommodation, only 1/3 of the height, according to this, although the section shows it not even that. The shape of that tower, which I've always quite liked, which is actually a Corbusian shape. It's based on the Quartier de la Marine skyscraper, 1938 of Corbusier. It's still there, more or less, although slightly altered. But the height, it is sufficient from his point of view to make it out that it's better by saying this is only going to be 1/3 of the height, irrespective of what kind of outlook the people have that are in the building. And then the same thing along the bottom there from the same text, where he shows the Treasury and the Foreign Office buildings on the right there, and how, as part which are obviously key to his Whitehall plan, and how the same amount of accommodation could be provided in 3 alternative formats, with slabs in the next to it, and then medium rise courtyards, and then low rise courtyards of the kind that he actually proposed. But the fact is that the slabs would offer much nicer accommodation for the people inside, who would have the outlook. They would have the outlook over the landscape, if you like. they would have light, space, greenery. The occupants of the Martin plan on the left there would not. But these same three alternatives, carried enormous conviction and influence. So this is from another Martin text at the time. So the pavilions, the linear street, or the court at the bottom there, and exactly the same three alternatives are offered by Richard Rogers in his diagram, and this drawing on the right, from Towards an Urban Renaissance, the officially commissioned report commissioned by Tony Blair, What We Should Do About Cities, published in 1999. And of course, the preferred solution by Rogers is the court solution at the bottom there. But these ignore architecture because the high-rise option, if you like, the one at the top, is always offered in a purely diagrammatic form, ignoring its architectural potential. As they are indeed in the diagrams I showed before, Martin, where you have the courtyards with the raking sides internally compared to a tower form with the raking base. And most unattractive from an architectural point of view. And you're prejudicing the argument if you present the three alternatives from an architectural point of view in as unattractive a light as that, I think. Martin, of course, so when it came to building courtyards and so on, there's of course the Harley Court here, which I think illustrates all the disadvantages of the courtyard form. I mean, none of the student accommodation there, with the exception of the single block that you see in the front, has a view of the greenery. The rest of it has a hard outlook straight into the room opposite. But that is the scheme that gets all the coverage. In his Buildings and Ideas book, that has 8 pages given to that, whereas the William Stone building here, next door here in Peterhouse, gets half a page, which is an 8-story building, which enjoys a very nice outlook over Coe Fen. I always assumed that that's why it was built as a tower, but it wasn't. If you read the text, Martin wanted it to be in 2 stories of 2 blocks of 4 stories. But the college, in the end, didn't want to lose as much ground as that. So the text says 2 clusters were eventually superimposed. It's not a scheme of which Martin was proud. He didn't give it any coverage at all. But the fact is that it allows everybody to have an outlook over the greenery. Nevertheless, one can find comparisons between the kind of diagrams that you find in Corbusier and in Martin. One of the Martin diagrams that always appealed to me was this one on the left here, showing how, by his very rudimentary calculation, I mean, it's all based on all sorts of assumptions, as I think unsubstantiated by actual figures, but that you could rearrange the accommodation in this central part of Manhattan in the form of courts, which would again be only, a third the height of the buildings that are actually there from the grid as generated. That title is important. The grid. What he means by the grid in the grid of as generators, the street grid. In other words, how wide are the streets apart from one another? But in this purely theoretical exercise, if you suppress all the streets and just retain the avenues, you can create these 28 courtyards which do allow people to look over greenery because they're large enough. And on that scale, if you could manage to get hold of that entire block of houses of land in central Manhattan, you could possibly create a greener environment of this kind. Because also another, as well as we'll see, because the Corbusier, given a chance, had a linear pattern of development. In other words, not towers, on the whole linear, but it may have been a taller linear. And then see that comparison of the scope for using redundant street space, if you like, for land use can be mirrored in a diagram on the right, or not diagram, plan on the right by Corbusier from the Ville Radieuse, showing his plan, which would require a street grid of 400-meter centres, as compared to the actual street grid in Les Halles or Les Halles adjacent. So the comparison between narrow existing street grid and potential from a wider street grid is that you get in Martin's appeared in Corbusier, what, 30 years earlier, that obviously with slightly different implications. And also you can parallel the comparisons on the left. This is from the Gritters generator again, where Martin compares a kind of Rockefeller-centered type of congregation of slabs close together, and it compares it to an axonometric of, in fact, Corbusier's proposed housing from, in fact, the city of 3 million, but prior to the radiant city, which is a comparison that Corbusier himself made in his book, City of Tomorrow, Urbanisme, which you can see on the right there. The same housing, Aradon, everybody has an outlook over greenery, whereas in the upper photo, obviously, nobody has an outlook over greenery because there isn't that. I mean, for me, the most attractive aspect of Martin's proposals come from, or always came from the ideas of this kind, that if you start pulling them, examining them in more detail, the problems with achieving them become more evident. And his scheme, following on from Colin Buchanan's, this traffic in towns, to show how you could replan the area of the Foundling, the section of London which he calls the Foundling, which is the section to the east of Bloomsbury, and where the what's it called? Anyway, the shopping street, the Brunswick Centre was eventually built. You could accommodate the same amount of accommodation into perimeter strips around the edge, and also leave room, as in this dotted rectangle on the right, for building a new hospital, because the hospitals that are there were constrained. This was the whole idea, that you could combine the same amount. If you have a perimeter scheme, you can combine the same amount of accommodation with green space and space for institutional functions within that space. And the problem is, I think, from my point of view, or at least not just mine, but you look at the section in the top left-hand corner there, that again, you have these forms with canted bases outwards. So when you join two courtyard formats like that together, then you get a very unappealing corridor space between them. And also, in this case, the secondary space in front there. I think you can, I don't know whether this works. We'll see. Does it work? Probably does somewhere. I can't see where. Oh yes, there. So then you get the two blocks backing onto one another, creating a sort of exactly the kind of corridor street which, let us say, Corbusier abhorred. And then you get a second one there. But in fact, these people don't actually benefit from a view of the green space because of the one in front, and so on. So that's, through there. So by looking at one square, as it were, you can in a way eliminate half the problems which are to do with what happens when the two squares confront one another. But that is, of course, it was nevertheless highly influential at that time and got built in both on the right there. On the left is actually the Brunswick estate, the Brunswick shopping centre, built by Patrick Hodgkinson, I suppose in direct with Leslie Martin's involvement. The back side of these things, it's all very well, the front side is always open to the sky, but the back side is not quite so attractive. In that particular case, because it faces Brunswick Square, it's relatively harmless, but except the very dark and unappealing space you get between the two sides. But on the right there is the Alexander Fleming house scheme at Camden Council, Alexandra Road, where again you see the same arrangement with a tapering or canted block at the back, in this case backing not onto another a roadway but onto a railway, and then with another secondary block in front and a green space beyond, certainly. But the fact is that none of the flats in the back benefit from a direct outlook onto the green space because of the block in front. I mean, I think that from a point of view, again, this, what I would call the Parker's Peace demonstration in Martin's work, which I always found appealing at the time. And it illustrates the same point. He takes a piece of the city up there, which he assumes has 5,000 people living there at 100 to the acre, which is about the same size as Parker's Piece here in Cambridge. And then he shows that you can either develop it in the form of parallel roads of terrace houses. But then that leaves the problem that he addresses is how are you going to rebuild that and provide room for both housing and for schools, together with all their playing fields and the open space that is required. Reading it reads so idealistically, because in the days he's writing, he's just saying it's absolutely adamant, a school has got to have this amount of playing fields and the population has got to have this amount of open space, and very good that is. But nowadays it's absolutely idealistic. None of the schools or the developments have anything like the amount of open space that he regards as essential. But he then shows how, if you work on the diagram, the amount of housing floor space that is required could be accommodated in a strip around the edge 3 stories high. But he realizes that if you would then imagine a roadway around that and then a similar strip on the other side, you would get a very long, 450 yards or something, unrelenting frontages, as it were, of corridor streets. So he is, as it were, more worked out solution to that. He pulls it in 10 meters from the edge and raises the height to 5 meters. None of this housing has any gardens, of course. It's simply the ground space that it occupies. And then you can have your schools and playing fields in the middle. Nevertheless, it is obviously spatially in itself, that is an attractive proposition. But the problem occurs if you have more than one of them. Is it a solution to the urban form as a whole? And this is kind of heightened by, if you look at a comment, an idea put forward by Lionel March, Leslie's mathematical genius right-hand man, who claimed to show that you could build semi-detached housing at 200 people to the acre, and that's what this diagram shows, as opposed to what most people think would be 40 to the acre or something like that. But this diagram shows that if you, in fact, say that this semi-detached housing doesn't have any gardens, then you can do it, in theory, by having the front of the house bang on the road. But in terms of, and this was part of Lionel March's, when he was trying to promote a linear form of development. Now, if you have long strips of these, you can regard, and he says in the text that this housing of this kind would be overlooking a paddock, is the word paddock. Well, the word paddock means an agricultural piece of ground. What that means is that all that land is taken out of the site area for purposes of density calculation. So that means that the site is very narrow indeed, and so you can claim a very high density, but it's only by virtue of recognizing that the overlooking space that the housing has isn't part of the site. You can allocate it to a different area. But when I was a student here, I couldn't, this diagram, I'd come up here with a sort of dual interest. On one hand, I was a townscape fanatic, enthusiast for traditional houses. On the other hand, I was also an admirer of Corbusier even then, and I couldn't understand why was it possible, how is it possible for Lionel March to claim you could build semi-detached housing at 200 to the acre, which is 500 to the hectare, whereas Corbusier was only claiming 1,000 to the hectare for radiant cities. So, which with housing 18 stories high, 17 stories, depending on how you count pilotis underneath. It seemed, and the answer is, of course, that if you can say that the overlooking space, if you like, for the Lionel March's housing is not part of the site, you can say the same thing for the radiant city. None of the ground you see there is part of the site from the point of view of density calculation. And if you go on, this is just, I'm not going to read all this, but you see the Ministry of, this is what I noticed at the time, that how do you calculate density? Well, the Ministry of Housing Local Government Circular stated that density was to be found by dividing the number of bed spaces by the site area in acres. The site area was to include space occupied by dwellings, cars, private gardens, small incidental open space such as drying yards and play areas, and roads in terms of the layout, but it should exclude land proper for appropriation for public open space, land used for all other types of development, e.g. schools, etc. So the question is, when does a small incidental bit of open space become land proper for appropriation for public open space. It's a matter of judgment or degree, really. The other interesting thing is that, well, I won't talk about all this now. The open space, well, if there's time, I might come to that. We'll see about that. And furthermore, yes, I mean, March, he was a mathematician and a greater commander than me, certainly, but he tries to model the diagram that Gropius used, showing the different, where he tries to assess the different advantages of parallel blocks with different, depending on how far apart or how high they're going to be with a constant light angle. And he shows in this diagram on the right there that, not surprisingly, you get more on it by going taller, but the benefit of going taller progressively declines. But he doesn't address the fact that the kind of ground you get between these blocks changes radically, depending on how far they are apart. The further they are apart, the more chance there is of using them for something else. So they can become not part of the site, if you like. And that you can demonstrate that in the case of the Radiant City, of Corb's Radiant City, where I've highlighted there on the left, the blue is the housing and the red is the roadways. So together, those occupy about 70% of the ground. So that means that, together they occupy about 30% of the ground. So that means that 70% of that ground is not part of the site for density calculation purposes. And that means that the density achieved there by Corbusier is actually 3,333 people per hectare, which means about 7 times higher, as much as Lionel March proposing for his semi-detached houses. And so that means that, which is not surprising, given that there are about 7 times the number of stories. So there's no magic to this. These semi-detached houses. This is exactly the same, but if you multiply it vertically by 7.5 times, you get the same densities for the Radiant City. I just, by way of comparison, I show the Martin's Whitehall plan on the right there, where the coverage of the site by roads and buildings is 85%. The greenery, if you like, is very limited indeed. And the scheme implied, again, as you see underneath, one of these sections with tapering with canted base. And so that sort of density achieved by the Radiant City is not illusory. This is a diagram I made as a student, actually, which compares the site plan of the Radiant City with Cambridge to the same scale, next to one another. And the population of the Radiant City is 1.5 million. In other words, it's 10 times as much as Cambridge, but apparently occupies the same amount of ground. And then next to it on the right, I've shown the Radiant City, the core plan to the same scale, and you see the housing element in the middle there. It's in a way doubly surprising because there are certain aspects that Corbusier seems to have got way out of scale. One can analyse this, but he shows 14 of those of his cruciform skyscrapers up there. Well, and then elsewhere he says that each one could accommodate 30,000 to 40,000 workers. So that means that you've got a working population in those towers of 500,000, which is, given that there's also a huge amount of industrial land shown at the bottom and other institutions all over the place, is far in excess of the working population for a town of 1.5 million. So he's vastly over-allowed, if you like, for employment space in his diagram. But nevertheless, just from the point of view of the residential accommodation, he has achieved a staggering density. There's no way of getting around it. In other respects too, he's sort of under him. These were all things I sort of studied at the time a bit, but I was always puzzled by why, in reality, as we know, if you build motorways with cloverleaf intersections through cities and so on, very few people like the results. Whereas in Corbusier's diagram, it always looks fine. So why is that? The answer is that if you actually look at the scale of the cloverleaf intersections that Corbusier shows, they're far too small. On the Radiant City, on the top right, left there, you'll see that is actually the cloverleaf as he draws it there, with the 10-meter in-diagonal radius specified, which is about the diagram of the ramp on a parking building. And then by the time he got to 1937, he appreciated that that was a bit too small. His plan for Paris in 1937 uses a 22-meter radius. But the Ministry of Transport guideline for cloverleaf said it had to be 55. This is in 1966. So, this occupies vastly much more space than Corbusier has allowed for it. It's not until 1961, Corbusier's Berlin plan on the right there, that the cloverleaf intersections start to acquire the scale that is actually required. And also his philosophy about traffic by this stage has totally changed, whereas in the plan 37 for Paris on the right, he has the main arteries going straight through the middle of the city. By the time you get to the Berlin plan 61, they're running around the outside. So that intersection there in the top right is the same as the one you see on the top left of the Berlin plan scheme below, to the same scale as these others. So Corbusier's, although you could say his grasp of traffic requirements and the desire to keep motorized traffic separate from pedestrian traffic is laudable, but he didn't allow for adequate space, at least not until latter. But it's quite interesting, this Berlin plan, because as in the Plan 37 for Paris, which is incidentally a much more realistic plan than the earlier Plan Voisin and so on. He has this main north-south artery going in a tunnel underneath the Seine and under the Ile de France and coming up, and similarly on the Berlin plan, he has this branch of the going under the Tiergarten in the tunnel. This is a slight aside, but this is a diagram I did of that Plan 37 for Paris, showing the 4 Y-shaped skyscrapers that he proposed. But the damage, if you like, is more limited than you might think, because this north-south axis is really along the lines of the Boulevard Sebastopol, and which runs between the Gare du Nord and the Gare de l'Est there. And the whole scheme actually avoids more or less any of the any of the key monuments of Paris, you know, the Louvre, the Place Royale, the Opera, that's the Gare Saint-Lazare, and the Arc de Triomphe. So all these, it is actually a more localized, and that's the Champs-Élysées. So this is running this east-west route, which he espoused since the early 20s, is running about a kilometre north of the Champs-Élysées. And the drawing he did, one of his sketches of it like that, emphasizes at the top there how all the, you know, it shows all the historic buildings that are being retained, if you like, the Notre Dame, the Louvre, on the hilltop, Sacré-Cœur and Panthéon on the France there. And then he adds his 4 Y-shaped skyscrapers. Underneath is a drawing I had made, because I couldn't do it myself, about 25 years ago when CAD, computer rendering, was coming in first. It was based on a photograph I'd taken from the Eiffel Tower looking south. So it's not in the right place, but where you can see the Tour Montparnasse, which is actually 60 stories. So that's exactly the same height as the towers proposed by Corbusier. So I thought, if I can use that tower to get the scale right, I can do a rendering just to feel what the spatial impact would be of this giganticism, if you like, and that does convey it quite well. The Tour Montparnasse is hidden by this one here, this one there. Another scheme from 37, which I find is quite interesting, and is again not very well known of Corbusier's work, but his proposal as to how what was called Îlot Insalubre, number 6, an east end of Paris unhealthy region that was scheduled for demolition, and how it could be rebuilt, in his view, or should be. Because what is interesting about it for me is that he's tackling here the specifics of a particular site, rather than it's just a theoretical exercise. But, and this gives you a visual impression, this was exhibited in his pavilion in the 37 International Fair in Paris. But it shows how these linear blocks here are, that the rest of the space is taken up, isn't just indeterminate open space, it is devoted to a whole range of functions, sports, education, etc. And it's quite specific in the brief, this is what is called for. So it shows that by the conjunction of 2 different functions, housing and libraries, schools, whatever, they can coexist. And he compares it, this is a page from one of his Œuvres Complètes, to the same scale with the kind of courtyard housing, if you like, that was being built for social housing at that time, underneath. And you can see that the experience of people in there looking into dark little courtyards like this is going to be far inferior to the kind of outlook that you would have from housing of that kind.
Oh, sorry, James.
I'm running out of time already, oh dear. Oh dear, well, okay, well, I've got to be very quick in that case. So that question of scale, this is important to grasp, because that's Corb's plan obvious for Algiers in 1929, which was supposedly copied at Sheffield, but by the Park Hill estate. But you could, this is the same scale set into. This is in fact tiny compared to the scale that Corbusier had envisaged. And the bigger the scale you make it, the more use you can actually use the space between for. So on these spaces on Park Hill, attractive though they are to some extent, but they can't actually be used. So these are probably classified as small incidental open spaces, not public open spaces. The same thing, this is this is the Hallfield estate in Paddington. That is about 300 meters. Was that the width of the core actually is 1.7 kilometers. So this is a fifth. Pleasant spaces, but liable to be taken up by something else. And this is what is going on all the time now. This is a tower near me in Islington, where the council sees these spaces. It isn't classed as they regard it as small incidental open spaces, so they're ready to build on it. So that's what's happened. And that's going on all over London. These are two major housing schemes in London, near me in Islington at the moment, the Holloway jail site, which is being rebuilt at densities of about 350 to the acre. I mean, vastly much more dense. And this is the new Barnsbury estate. That shows the footprint has doubled. The height of the building is doubled. And they get away with it because the greenery, and then you get these courtyard formats appearing here, and also so-called muse developments between. The sense of light spent space and greenery is gone. This is the King's Cross development, which is a proposal I advanced in 1990, inspired by Leslie Martin to some extent, the idea that you could have a linear block around a central space, and in that way you could have both green space and development, because Islington, which is on this side of the road, has almost no open space. It's the lowest percentage of open space. So they said, why can't we have some open space? And we be lent some by the neighbour, by Camden. But what has in fact been built is this on the right here. And the amount of open space is just that. So none of this has any outlook over open space. A bit of Leslie Martin's approach might have helped. I won't go to all this. This is another perspective here. This is a scheme I advanced about 5 years ago, dispersed densification. This is an area called Ernö Oak in South London, where there are occasional towers like that one there. And a client of mine had this site here, which is, and I proposed that he could put a tower on that. This is a sink, a site of interest for nature conservation. It has a scout hut there, and I reckoned you could build a tower on the site of the scout hut. And this conjunction of lower building and high building, it's perfectly viable. That from a tower like this, you can benefit from outlook over the suburban environment, because you look out over the roofs, you benefit from the greenery. So you can get sun, space and greenery as an objective in there. That was a montage of that existing building I worked on, the Goldfinger building, just placed there by way. And this just shows you how you can put a building like that, occupying, housing 340 people onto the site of a pair of semi-detached houses, suburban houses, which house perhaps 24 or 30, depending on how you calculate it. And that could be a principle to serving London's housing shortage. If you use the outer London suburbs and built towers of that kind on small incidental open spaces at half-kilometre centres on 2/3 of each of these. This is a schematic drawing of London, 42 kilometres squared, showing that the central area is undeveloped. But we'll leave it out of this argument that the outer boroughs occupy 8/9 of the area of the capital. And you could build the same now this is the penultimate picture. So whereas planning now, insofar as it approves high-rise buildings at all, thinks they should be clustered. And this is the so-called eastern cluster of the City of London. They haven't yet built this, but that's on its way up. As you see, these tower forms close together, create dark voids. They're totally inimical to human occupation. Just by way of comparison, this is, because I worked on this, Goldfinger's Balfron Tower and Caradel House. These two buildings, which can be compared to the street housing beyond there, this is a drawing from 1965, create a space around which has potential as a dynamic experience, and very exciting it is too if you go there. And finally, just so that thing of space, you know, this is Corbusier's book, 1948, New World of Space, and Leslie Martin's book, Urban Space and Structures. There isn't, in fact, much discussion of space in urban space and structures, and you could say this is a contrast between, as it were, sensual space and calculated space. But the point is that the Martin space, as that diagram shows, is enclosed, whereas the Corbusian space is open. And I think that is a vital distinction. I think insofar as the modern aesthetic is using space as the dynamic function, it needs to be open. And whereas a closed space implies a facade, and a facade requires decoration. I think so. I think the future lies, if you like, in this contrast, I hope, with the Corbusian view of space. Thank you, that's it.